faraway land called Egypt, the Israelites lived as slaves. They worked hard every day, building things for the Egyptian Pharaoh. But life was hard and they were very sad. They wanted to be free, to live happily with their families. So they prayed to God to help them. One day, God chose a special man named Moses to help the Israelites. God spoke to Moses and told him to go to Pharaoh and ask him to let the Israelites go free. Moses was nervous but trusted God and went to Pharaoh. Moses stood before Pharaoh and said, "God has told me to tell you, let my people go." But Pharaoh was stubborn. He didn't want to lose his slaves, so he said, "No." So God decided to send signs called plagues to show Pharaoh that he was serious. There would be 10 plagues in all, each one different from the last. The first plague, water turns to blood. Moses went to the river and touched the water with his staff, and suddenly the water turned red like blood. The fish died, and the water smelled bad. No one could drink it. Pharaoh watched, but shook his head. He still refused to let the people go. The second plague, frogs everywhere. Then God sent the second plague. This time, frogs came hopping out of the river. Frogs were everywhere. They were in people's homes, in their beds, even in their ovens. Pharaoh was bothered by the frogs and said, "All right, take them away and I'll let the people go." But when the frogs went away, Pharaoh changed his mind and said, "No." The third plague, gnats. So God sent the third plague. Tiny bugs called gnats filled the air. They flew around and bothered everyone, tickling their faces and crawling everywhere. Pharaoh's people were uncomfortable, but Pharaoh still wouldn't listen. The fourth plague, flies. Then came the fourth plague, flies. Swarms of flies filled the land, buzzing and making everyone miserable. The flies were everywhere except where the Israelites lived. Pharaoh called Moses and said, "All right, I'll let your people go if you take away the flies." But as soon as the flies were gone, Pharaoh changed his mind again. The fifth plague, sick animals. For the fifth plague, God made the animals of Egypt sick. The horses, donkeys, camels, cows, and sheep all became ill. But still Pharaoh said no to letting the Israelites go. The sixth plague, boils. Then came the sixth plague. People and animals in Egypt broke out in painful sores called boils. They itched and hurt a lot. Even Pharaoh's helpers were covered in boils. But still, Pharaoh wouldn't change his mind. The seventh plague. Hail for the seventh plague. God sent a terrible hailstorm with huge chunks of ice falling from the sky. The storm was so strong that it destroyed crops and hurt animals outside. But in the land where the Israelites lived, there was no hail. Once again, Pharaoh promised to let the Israelites go if the storm stopped. But when it did, he said, no. The eighth plague, locusts. Then came the eighth plague. Moses raised his staff, and a huge swarm of locusts filled the sky. These were hungry insects that ate up all the plants and trees. Pharaoh was desperate and promised to let the Israelites go if the locusts left. But as soon as they were gone, he changed his mind once more. The ninth plague, darkness. For the ninth plague, God sent darkness. A thick, heavy darkness covered Egypt. No one could see anything for 3 whole days. But there was light where the Israelites lived. Pharaoh called Moses and said, "All right, you can go, but leave your animals behind." But Moses insisted they all be allowed to go. Pharaoh grew angry and still refused. The 10th plague, the loss of the firstborn. Finally, the 10th and last plague came. God told Moses that this plague would be the most serious. That night, every firstborn child in Egypt would pass away, but God gave the Israelites special instructions to stay safe. They were to mark their doors with lamb's blood, so that God's Spirit would pass over their homes. At midnight, the last plague came, and there was great sadness in Egypt. Pharaoh finally realized he could not keep the Israelites. He called Moses and said, "Go, take your people and leave Egypt." And this time, he meant it. The Israelites quickly gathered their things and left Egypt that very night. God had heard their prayers, and they were finally free. They walked out of Egypt with joy in their hearts, following Moses, ready to start a new life. And so, that's the story of how Moses helped free his people, with God's help, after the 10 plagues. It's a story of courage, faith, and freedom.